It is April 7th of 1945, and over the Pacific Ocean is a massive flight of American B-29 bombers, also known as the Super Fortress. This new cutting-edge bomber with its outstanding range and heavy payload has been assigned to bomb mainland Japan, and specifically for today, the Nakajima Aircraft Factory in Tokyo. At an altitude of just 10,000 feet and in the middle of the day, the bombers, however, are vulnerable. Approaching at nearly 400 miles an hour, nearly 100 Japanese fighters who have been scrambled to intercept. But instead of an unhindered attack on the American bombers, they are in for a surprise. For the first time in the war, American fighters have joined airspace over mainland Japan, providing escort for the B-29s. These Mustangs, making up the first members of the Tokyo Club, are about to enter their first dogfight, one of the largest of the war, as they aim to set the rising sun of Imperial Japan. Many had wondered, was this feat even possible? Could Mustangs make it to Japan? And if they did, how would they fare against Japanese interceptors with a home field advantage? As this group of bold and elite fighter pilots attempt to make history and take on Imperial Japan, the challenges would be great and the cost extraordinary. But their story is one that must be told. 1 month earlier, in March of 1945, American forces were starting to finish up the battle for Iwo Jima, a bloody struggle over a small stretch of volcanic sand in the western Pacific. The campaign, which had cost the Allies nearly 7,000 men, was undertaken with one primary goal: the capture of her two large airfields. These airstrips would be crucial to solving a problem faced by American commanders at the time. Currently, B-29s flying out of the Marianas were bombing Tokyo and its surrounding industrial targets in an effort to cripple Japanese war production. But things were not going well. Originally, the bombing missions were operated with tactics similar to those used in Europe, from a high altitude upwards of 30,000 feet in the daytime. But crews quickly found out that this was not Europe. Instead, over coastal Japan, jet streams were vicious at the high altitudes, and bombs were often dropping miles away from their intended target, rendering the high-level bombing campaign completely ineffective. This problem would be solved temporarily by implementing night bombing with incendiary bombs, with the aim of burning Japanese cities that played an important role in the production of war materials. This plan was successful but horrific. On the night of March 9, 1945, American bombers firebombed the city, killing 100,000 and destroying 25% of Tokyo. But despite this success, the job wasn't finished. While the small production in the civilian housing had been destroyed, a handful of large factories and industrial targets remained. But these would require precision bombing. High-altitude strikes or nighttime area bombardment lacked the accuracy needed to eliminate these targets. So, for this mission, the bombers would have to come in low, facing the brunt of Japan's best fighter defense in the middle of the day. And that is where the P-51 Mustangs were called in. In March, Iwo Jima was mostly in American hands, and work began on its two airfields immediately. Some of the first aircraft to arrive were Mustangs from two brand new units, the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups. The assignment of these groups was no small feat.
Unlike a normal escort mission in Europe or the South Pacific, these missions were excruciatingly long, no less than 1,300 miles, with a typical mission time of 8 hours or more. In addition, these pilots were not fully trained in navigation, as was needed to execute the long journey over the barren ocean. It was extremely difficult to hit such a small island such as Iwo Jima with no landmarks to go by. There was simply no room for error. So, whenever possible, these fighters had to rely on navigational B-29s to guide them in their journey. And if they became separated, it was a long and lonely flight back, simply hoping that your heading was correct. These parameters would push both the men and their machines to the limits, as the island of Iwo Jima barely put Tokyo within range, allowing for just a small time in the combat area before needing to turn back for the long flight home. It would take a handful of resilient and courageous men to carry out the task. These pilots, a mix of veterans and green aviators, arrived on Iwo Jima just a few days after the fighting had died down. And their first impression of their new home was far from welcoming.
On arrival on Iwo, I was surprised by the lack of vegetation, which had been destroyed by air bombing, heavy offshore naval fire, ground fire, and the creation of dugouts, built mostly by the Japanese. Many dead Japs had been quickly buried and only partially covered, and some were still exposed.
At this point, Iwo Jima was a smoldering pile of ash, and the ground was littered with mines and dead Japanese. But to make matters worse, the fighting wasn't even actually over.
While American Marines continued to clear out the last Japanese holdouts in tunnels across the island, the pilots would have their introduction to combat not in their cockpits, but instead in the tents on Iwo Jima, in hand-to-hand combat.
In the middle of the night on March 26, 1945, as pilots slept in their tents, the last major Japanese assault on Iwo Jima began. With screams of banzai, Japanese soldiers, armed only with swords and grenades, attacked the pilots in tents on the north side of Airfield No. 2. By the time the attack was over and Marine reinforcements arrived, 14 men, mainly pilots of the 21st Fighter Group, had been killed, with 50 wounded, before they even had the chance to fly their first escort mission. No doubt wanting to get their chance to strike Tokyo now more than ever, the waiting became tough. But on April 1st, a promising sign appeared, as the P-51s were finally assigned their first long-range training mission. This would see them take a simple flight from their bases on Iwo to Saipan to familiarize themselves with long flights over water, navigation, and formation cohesiveness. Being less than half the distance to Japan, this was supposed to be a simple flight. But instead, it would highlight the monumental challenges of the job that they were about to undertake. Less than half of the P-51s would complete the simple flight, with the majority having to either turn back to Iwo due to mechanical issues or landing in Saipan for fuel or repairs. In the typical studies of the Mustang action recorded over Europe, the P-51 is often seen as reliable, rarely having engine or gun troubles. But for the long-range escorts on Iwo Jima in 1945, it was quickly becoming clear that the circumstances here were different. The volcanic ash on the island was causing a variety of problems for the aircraft, in a unit where engine failure often meant capture by the Japanese or bailing out in the middle of the Pacific, both of which were often fatal. But furthermore, it affected other systems as well. Machine gun jams were statistically far more common here than in England, and even radio systems experienced regular issues from these island airfields.
It was a discouraging start for Curtis LeMay, the man heading the strategic bombing campaign over Japan. But luckily for the combat-hungry Mustang pilots, despite the clear problems, there was no time to wait. The escorts were needed, ready or not.
On April 7th of 1945, less than 1 week later, the opportunity would come in the form of their first official long-range escort mission. Here, they were assigned to watch over a force of B-29s who were headed to strike the Nakajima aircraft factory. At this time, the Japanese were in an all-out defensive state. They had lost nearly all meaningful possessions in the Pacific, and in doing so, had lost many of their seasoned pilots. Allied forces were pushing closer to the mainland, and the final fighter defenses were called forward to try and protect their homeland. With their dwindling fuel, however, many pilots placed in frontline duties lacked proper training and were not experienced in combat. But since the battle was taking place over Tokyo, there were some seasoned aviators who joined the fight that had not been able to fly combat in the previous years. These would include many trainers or wounded aces that had been sent back to Japan to recover or teach flying. And so, like the Germans over the Reich, while the Japanese fighters were mostly flown by amateurs, some seasoned aces could still be found among their ranks. The Imperial Japanese Army was also able to bring forward its last remaining quality aircraft for this battle, including many models that saw little action elsewhere in the war. This included aircraft like the Ki-44, 45, and 61. Some of these had substantial improvements over the Zero that sought to deliver more firepower and increase survivability over the brittle and flammable aircraft used earlier in the war by Japan. But perhaps the most formidable defense was one that resided only with the Japanese. As they had shown all throughout the previous months of fighting, these young pilots were willing to die for honor and for their emperor. This meant that their tactics would often not just involve aerial fighter attacks, but instead ramming, which all too soon became a very real threat for the crews on the B-29s. Because of this, the men on board of the bombers were no doubt thrilled when they saw their first little friends appear in the distance on April 7th of 1945. After the long flight over the Pacific, the P-51s linked up with the bomber formations just off the coast of Japan. They positioned themselves over the B-29s and headed towards their target, preparing to become the first American fighters to enter airspace over Tokyo. As they were nearly at the coast, the radio crackled to life. Bandits, 12 o'clock. In the distance were multiple groups of Japanese fighters, primarily Ki-44 and Ki-45 interceptors. The Imperial Japanese pilots were shocked, as for the first time, they see the mighty B-29s are not alone. But now, in addition to the monumental task of trying to bring down the bombers, they will have to contend with fighters as well. Fighters that were faster and in most cases flown by far better pilots. At approximately 10:40 a.m., contact was made and the first massive dogfight over Tokyo began. Across the sky, the defenders roared in and the escorts engaged. Very quickly, the P-51s went to work, wanting to ensure their trials were worth it, and that the Banzai attack 2 weeks prior which took the lives of a dozen of their pilots, was avenged. Shortly into the engagement, Lieutenant Dick Hintermeyer spotted a twin-engine Ki-45. He sent a burst into it. Then Captain Bob Down, a fellow 47th Squadron pilot, came in and finished it, claiming the first U.S. Army Air Force fighter kill over Japan during World War II. Courtesy of the National Archives, we also have some excellent shots of combat in these missions, just like this first Ki-45 claimed. As the dogfight raged, no doubt below, the Japanese people in Tokyo looked skyward and for the first time witnessed the war as it truly was. And what they saw was not encouraging. Mustangs all over the sky fired away, drilling the Japanese fighters before most got a chance to hit the bombers. While the superfortresses pounded the Nakajima aircraft factory, the P-51s scored kill after kill, bringing down the interceptors and their fighters all throughout the area. Leading the scoring would be 78th Squadron leader Major Jim Tapp, who tallied 4 confirmed kills on this day, including 3 single-engine and 1 twin-engine fighter, becoming the top-scoring pilot in the Tokyo Club. But he was not alone. The tallies added up fast, and the victory was even better than anyone could have imagined. As their short time over the combat area ran out, the Mustangs turned for home. Against the odds of their long trip, and to their great satisfaction, the victory was incredible. The P-51 Mustangs had hammered the Japanese over their own soil, and they had done it on their very first mission.
When they arrived back on Iwo Jima, the scores were counted. The final total for the mission was 26 confirmed kills for the Americans, for the loss of just 2 P-51s, one to a compressibility explosion and the other to engine trouble. But more importantly, only 3 of the 400 B-29s had been lost, 2 to flak and 1 to a phosphorus bomb. It was a great triumph, and the strategy that so many had worked so hard for had finally been proven effective. But Japan was far from finished. There was still plenty of work to be done.
The P-51s were up in the air again on April 12th, but challenges prevented some from reaching the rendezvous. Delays on takeoff caused them to waste precious fuel on Iwo Jima, meaning they wouldn't be able to make it all the way to Japan. Some of the Mustangs had no choice but to turn back, aborting the mission, while others carried on, hoping that they would have enough fuel to get back home. The boys of the Tokyo Club met up with the bombers as they approached the Nakajima aircraft factory yet again. This time, again, Japanese interceptors arrived right on schedule. Another large dogfight broke out, and the Americans got back to work. They would tally no less than 15 confirmed kills here, but it wouldn't come without a cost. The Japanese finally struck back, bringing down First Lieutenant James Beatty by fire from a Navy J-2M Raiden, the first air-to-air loss for the unit. Major Jim Tapp, though, would also tally his 5th kill, flying his Mustang, Margaret IV, becoming the unit's first ace as he brought down an elite Ki-61 fighter. Tragically, however, in this chase, his wingman, First Lieutenant Fred White, was flying so close that one of the spent bullet shells from his leader's plane was sucked up into his air scoop, causing his engine to fail. He attempted to bail out over the ocean, but his parachute would fail, causing him to fall thousands of feet to his death. The rest of the men, fairly happy with the results from the day, headed back for the long flight home. Upon landing, many didn't realize how close they had cut it. According to reports, many of the Mustang's fuel tanks were completely empty upon their arrival to the hard stands, with one pilot even running out as his Mustang touched the runway, having to be towed back to its stand.
Pilots had to remember, this wasn't England or Guadalcanal. This was the longest, most dangerous, and riskiest mission path ever flown by a fighter pilot. A few wasted minutes could mean the difference between life and death. There was simply no more room for error, especially when their next sortie would be even more dangerous. Now, as we learn about these stories, what if I told you that you could hold in your hand a piece of history from missions just like these? Well, now you can. This video's sponsor is one of my personal favorites, the World War II card series from Historic Autographs. Historic Autographs has spent years carefully sourcing some of the most extraordinary and meaningful relics in collecting history, turning this product into every history buff's dream. Alongside their fascinating base cards in the World War II set, you can also find authentic sand recovered from the beaches of Normandy and Pearl Harbor, along with historic DNA samples and even United States Army Air Force flight gear, authentic and worn by pilots and crews, just like the ones in this video. You can also find cards with genuine D-Day artifacts, pieces of landing craft, gliders, or even soldier-worn armbands from the invasion itself. And as if that wasn't enough, the World War II set also includes real cut autographs from fighter pilots, famous service members, and even Medal of Honor recipients during World War II. It's not just a card set, it's a tribute to leadership, courage, and the moments that changed the world. Don't miss your chance to own a real piece of history. Check out the World War II series at the link below today. The perfect gift for any history fan. And you can get 15% off with my promo code here. Now, speaking of crucial moments in history, I believe one had just arrived for the pilots on the shores of Iwo Jima.
On April 16th, the boys of the Tokyo Club would get a new assignment. By the late spring of 1945, the battle for Okinawa had begun, and with it came a new threat for the Allies. This was the onslaught of Japanese suicide bombers, the kamikaze. These attacks were doing serious damage to the American fleet off the coast at Okinawa and had to be dealt with. The only real way to do this was to hit them at the source. The men called upon for this job were the Mustangs of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, the Tokyo Club. The task assigned to them was a low-level fighter sweep on an airfield just outside of the city, where intel had reported that many of these kamikaze flights were coming from. After the 4-hour flight from Iwo Jima, the Mustangs arrived, but this time at a slightly lower altitude to come in and hit the enemy before they ever had a chance to mount an attack. This first strike was less than stellar, as the Americans struggled to find the airfield, and when they did, few airplanes were present. Japanese ground fire would claim one when an anti-aircraft battery struck a Mustang. Her pilot, First Lieutenant James Whiteman, would bail out over the ocean, but yet again, his chute failed, killing the pilot. Now, to make matters worse, it somehow seemed as if the hellish landscape of Iwo Jima was causing parachutes to fail. The next 2 missions assigned to the Mustangs were also fighter sweeps, and fortunately, these would go better, as the P-51s came in on the deck and located their target airfields, which were covered with aircraft, ripe for the picking. As they tore through, each airstrip was left in flames, with squadrons adding a number of ground kills as payment for their lengthy journey. If nothing else, the silver lining of these missions was the encouragement that flak defenses here in Tokyo were far less lethal than those seen by the Mustangs in low-level strikes over Germany the year prior.
But still, the biggest battle and greatest loss of the war for the long-range Mustangs was yet to come, and they would arrive one after the other.
After a few weeks of bad weather, the Mustangs finally took off again for an escort mission to raid the port of Yokohama. At 10:20 a.m., 454 B-29s roared underneath as they arrived over Tokyo. And as the target neared, up ahead was the largest defending force that any of the men had yet seen. Formations of Japanese fighters filled the sky, and melees broke out all across the massive formation of bombers. The Mustangs sent the aircraft of the rising sun burning in all directions. Zeros, Geckos, Raidens, and all other sorts of planes fell into the crosshairs of the escorts. Perhaps the most notable would come from the guns of a green-tailed Mustang. This was a new leader emerging in the kill race, Captain Todd Moore, and his P-51, Stinger, who tallied 3 kills and brought his total to 9, passing Jim Tapp for the top score of the Tokyo Club. When the scoreboards were set, the final tally was 28 kills for just 1 loss, their greatest victory of the war. The Japanese failures to optimize their defensive strategies were now clearly costing them dearly. Their radar defenses and communication with fighter groups were poor, especially when compared to that of Britain, who 5 years earlier had already developed and implemented efficient and effective radar systems to vector fighter groups to targets. Furthermore, lack of communication and cooperation within the Navy and Army continued to destroy effectiveness, as different groups of Japanese interceptors operated completely independently, leading to massive American wins in the dogfights. But with these victories came sacrifice. By this time, even though only a handful of missions had been flown, the number of pilots killed was higher than many other units would have considered acceptable. And in particular, the number of men who had drowned in the ocean after successful bailouts was particularly disheartening. One man who sought to solve this problem was Lieutenant Colonel Joseph "Smokey" Walther. Smokey was the flight surgeon for the entire unit on Iwo, and after witnessing one too many men meet their demise in the Pacific waters before they could be rescued, he presented a bold idea. His thought was that a paramedic could be available and on site to bail out of a PBY flying boat, landing in the water to provide aid and assistance to the downed airmen until help could arrive. When none of his own paramedics volunteered to test this brave theory, he himself stepped up to try and rescue a dummy from the water as a trial for the idea.
In doing so, the brave doctor nearly drowned as one of his CO2 bottles in his Mae West life vest failed after hitting the water. He would save the dummy, but barely. The program was scrapped as a result, but it did save lives. After this, it was ordered that all CO2 bottles were tested in the unit's Mae West life vests, and half of them were found to be defective. Pilot drownings then decreased as a result.
Further causing sympathy for the pilots on Iwo Jima was the clear amount of physical stress that they were under. The long flight to Tokyo was unimaginably taxing, being cramped into a small cockpit with little movement for sometimes upwards of 9 hours. This would take such a heavy toll on the bodies of pilots that, according to grounds crews, it became a regular occurrence for men to have to be physically lifted and carried from their cockpits after a mission. Lieutenant Colonel Walters saw to this as well, by bribing a few of the Seabees on Iwo Jima. These Seabees, who notably had taken some of the heaviest losses of the war, gladly obliged when Smokey bribed them with liquor from the squadron's medicinal supply. Their task, to build him a spa for the Tokyo Club pilots.
From henceforth, the pilots flying from Iwo Jima had some of the best accommodations of the war, thanks to the natural hot water on the island and some of the best doctors in the service. But even all of this could not prevent the tragedy that would unfold on June 1st of 1945.
On this morning, the P-51s were sent to escort a large raid to Osaka, one that was ordered against the advice of the group's weather experts. Everything went normal for the first leg of the flight, as the Mustangs took off from Iwo Jima on time, and initially in clear skies. Then they were ordered to form up on their lead navigational B-29, as was typical practice to guide them to their rendezvous point. But this morning, their lead B-29's designated flight navigator was inexperienced and hadn't yet completed any trips to Tokyo. So when they were halfway to their target, he was not ready for what appeared up ahead. In front of the flight was a storm cloud, and by the time they realized the size of what was in front of them, it was too late. The heavy Mustangs, laden with fuel tanks and throttles low to conserve fuel, went head-on into the clouds, hopeful that it would be brief and that they would quickly come out of the other side. But that wasn't the case. In seconds, all visibility was lost, and according to some veterans, they could not even see their wingtips. Immediately, some of the heaviest winds in the Pacific and heavy rain pounded the flight of Mustangs. While the bombers with 4 engines could make it through, the P-51s were not fit for such a task. All formation was suddenly lost, and the radio became a chaotic mess. As the aircraft were thrown about, inevitable collisions occurred, and each pilot had to fend for himself. One of the survivors would later recall in his report.
The front was entered between 10,000 and 11,000 feet. Visibility was 0. Rain heavy. Turbulence intense and violent. Groups, squadrons, flights and elements lost contact and scattered. Traffic on all radio channels was so heavy that communication was nearly impossible. Some pilots lost control completely, spun, recovered, and spin again. Some recovered in time and some did not.
Another flight leader from the 462nd Squadron wrote as follows.
We headed straight into the soup. Our leader was interrupted by screams of pilots on the radio, airplanes bumping into each other, mid-air collisions, shouts of bailouts, and pilots in spins. My radio then fell silent. After about 15 minutes of climbing, the sun was shining and I could see my gun barrels covered with ice. We never saw another P-51 until we landed at Iwo, 7 hours later. When we landed, all our friends climbed onto our wings and seemed genuinely happy to see us. It was then we got the bad news about the mission. The good Lord really looked after us.
Only 27 Mustangs would punch through to meet the bombers. One of them would be First Lieutenant Robert Scamara, who essentially ended up escorting a large group of B-29s completely alone. He would later recall.
I was one of the lucky ones that made it through okay. I don't know what happened to my wingman. He's still missing in action. I went on alone towards the target and got there while bombing was underway. I escorted several groups of B-29s over the target, which was one big fire. Finally, I saw a 2-engine Nick heading for the bombers. He probably never saw me. My first burst from the left side knocked out his left engine, and set him on fire. I coasted across behind him to his right side, giving him another burst just to get camera coverage of my kill, as I was alone and I had no other witnesses. This was a must to get credit for a kill.
After making it back to base, Lieutenant Scamara was told the bad news, that many of his friends were gone. As was his duty, with a heavy heart, he went to claim his kill, only to be told that his gun camera footage was improperly inserted. With no footage recorded, it looked as if he had no witness to his kill. More bad news to an already disastrous day. But luckily, one single B-29 gunner had reported seeing a Japanese fighter go down, and no other claims were submitted. So his kill was confirmed, the sole P-51 victory in the mission.
For the Americans on the June 1st mission, one single Japanese fighter had been slain. But the cost was staggering. Of the 148 aircraft sent out on the mission, 24 pilots were lost, swallowed by the massive storm. Whole flights simply vanished, and to this day, there are no details about multiple men who went missing. It was to be their darkest day of the war, the Black Friday of the Pacific.
After a lengthy period to recover from their losses, the men were assigned another mission on June 10th, 9 days later, an opportunity to avenge those who were lost. Things went back to normal here, as more than 100 Japanese aircraft attacked, and the Americans got their payback and more. The Tokyo Club claimed 24 kills for no losses, and as a bonus, not a single B-29 was lost. Around this time, the Japanese could see their inevitable fate if a change was not made. So, in late June of 1945, fighter defenses were pulled back for reserve, as what little aircraft they had left would certainly be needed for the defense in the Allies' expected invasion. Because of this, the next few missions for the Tokyo Club saw fewer and fewer air engagements, negating the purpose of their escort. Thus, their role shifted. The Iwo Jima-based Mustangs were now reassigned to low-level attack, strafing supply lines, airfields, and anything else of value on the ground. With this role, and the development of color gun camera film, we have some incredible shots of these strafing attacks as the Mustangs hit trains, airfields, and shipping, while the Japanese, with little to no air defenses left, could do little to stop them. This role, however, would bring about one of the most tragic stories for the long-range Mustangs on July 3rd of 1945. Here, the P-51s were sent to strafe a harbor when one single Mustang was hit by ground fire. First Lieutenant Richard Schroepel barely had time to bail out over the harbor as his plane caught fire. He would survive, but once in the water, Japanese guns from the shore began to open fire on him. American destroyers and submarines were close by and were sent to rescue him, but under fire, he needed help fast. The Mustangs immediately got to work attempting to suppress the gunfire from the shore, and a B-17 equipped with a rescue raft was even flown in to drop him a lifeline. But while the rescue vessels were still on their way, Lieutenant Schroepel was hit and killed as he floated in the water. One of the final combat losses for the Tokyo Club, killed by the brutality and ruthlessness of the Japanese. Over the next few weeks, the long-range Mustangs continued their suppression and ground attack missions. They would score a few more aerial victories over the Japanese before their last mission of the war, and would see the B-29s strike near Honshu. As the fighters were on their way back to Iwo, a call went out over the radio, telling them that the war was likely over, to which one of them replied, "Well, the Japs sure as hell don't know it." During their 6 months of combat operations, the VLR, or Very Long Range Mustang units, racked up 452 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground, saving the lives of many B-29s and their crews. The sacrifice paid, though, was not small. 130 Mustangs were lost, with 121 men killed or taken captive. This made this particular unit one of the most deadly fighter assignments of the war, seeing higher losses than almost any other group of pilots.
The task was monumental, and their journey long. But for the brave men that flew these Mustangs, to see the rising sun set at the end of it all made it well worth it. For in their minds there would be no higher honor than to be called a member of the Tokyo Club. In case you didn't know, I'm not AI. I'm TJ, and I make all these videos by myself. If you want to support my work so I can keep making them, please consider joining my Patreon here and sign up for my free newsletter to get all sorts of behind-the-scenes content on what I'm working on next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.